Hello and welcome back to Cooking the Books with me, Gilly Smith, the podcast which takes us through 4 food moments from the books of our favourite food writers. It's about life through the prism of food. And this week we're with Giulia Crouch to look at the diet of the blue zones that will make us not only live long and healthy lives, but is the happiest diet in the world.
It's really like a celebration of the wisdom of grandmothers. These nonnas in Italy or, grandmas in India, they have known this kind of wisdom for a long time. And now science, I feel like, is just catching up with it.
Now, little known fact, the very first book I wrote back in 1993 on the back of a Channel 4 series called Food File was The Mediterranean Health Diet, How to Lose Weight and Live Longer. The TV show and the book was inspired by a village in southern Italy which scientists discovered had the best diet in the world, and reflected the interest in what even the government back then was telling us would save our NHS, already buckling under the weight of our diet-related diseases. 30 years later, many Western societies are obesogenic, with increasing numbers living in food insecurity, undernourished by an all-powerful fast food industry. I asked Giulia why she thinks we're still trying to work out how to eat well.
Because we know how good it is for you. And I think the reason that we're quite focused on it is because our food environment in the UK has become so warped. We have so many problems with the way we think about eating. And I think it's multifaceted. We have this big food industry that's obviously not incentivized to think about our health. They just want to make money. We also have a lot of confusion, and I think it's making us particularly neurotic about food. There are so many people on the internet talking absolute nonsense, really, really damaging things for people. But because there's all of this noise, people don't really know what to believe. And consistently now, with many, many studies, we can see that the Mediterranean diet is particularly good for you. It's effective and it's also joyful, which I care about so much. I think that food should always be fun and not restrictive. And this is why the book is called The Happiest Diet in the World, because it's about happiness. And I think that really the overriding message is how important it is to have a happy relationship with eating, which is, I think, what you get in the Mediterranean diet, because there's not restriction, there's not the demonization of different foods. You eat basically everything, and there's just more of a kind of common sense approach. It's about balance, it's about moderation, and it's about enjoyment. And if you don't have that enjoyment, you're going to ultimately fail.
Exactly. I mean, it was hilarious when I was making a television programme. Before I wrote the book, we made a television programme. And so we were interviewing all the nonnas. Of course, they didn't speak English. And they thought we were crazy, the kind of questions we were asking. What do you mean? But they did have the oldest living people in the world at that time. And it was very clear. It was super, super clear what was happening there. I mean, we were using the nutritionists to look at their and the scientists to look at their studies, but actually we were talking to people. Yeah. And what was happening was they were eating chickens that run up hills. So they were eating very lean chicken. Everybody had their own olive groves, and so there was a lot of exercise, just as you say in your book. Everybody walked everywhere. Everybody ate together. Everything was done there and then, and people lived there for a very long time. So there was a genuine sense of community, and they laughed.
Yeah.
It is the happiest diet in the world. But you go beyond this. You go to the blue zones. So tell us about the 9 pillars of the blue zones and where those blue zones are.
So the blue zones are in Loma Linda, California, Okinawa, Japan, Sardinia in Italy, Icaria in Greece, and Nicoya in Costa Rica, which all superficially are, very different places with different cooking traditions. But when you look at these overarching food principles by which they eat, they are all similar. So they have a very plant-centric diet, which we know is very good for gut health. They, the whole range of plants. I think when people talk about plants, they just imagine like lettuce or kale. And it's obviously, the world of plants is enormous. So grains, legumes, seeds, nuts, herbs, so much food. And that is really the basis of their diet. Then they eat a little bit of meat. As you say, it tends to be high quality. They eat a little bit of fish, they eat dairy. Quite interestingly, it tends to be fermented quite a lot, which is another thing that new science is now learning is very good for your gut health, which in turn is good for your overall health. And a really, really key factor about their diet is that they cook real food themselves. There is not a reliance on ultra processed foods. In fact, the super agers there, the people who've got into their 90s and 100s and are still fit and active and engaged in their community, they have spent their whole lives not eating this kind of thing. And I think that when you look at their diet and you directly compare it to ours, that's one of the most striking differences, which also plays into their view on sugar. I think sugar can be really, really demonized, especially at the moment. And it needn't be, because sugar is such a fantastic thing. I start my chapter on sugar with basically like an ode to puddings and how fantastic they are, talking about sticky toffee pudding and rhubarba in Italy and eclairs in France. They're such an important part of our society, and rightly so, they should be. Sugar means ice cream and birthdays and so many happy occasions. But because of the massive amount of ultra processed food that we eat, we're accidentally consuming quite a lot of sugar, and people just don't realize. Whereas they don't shun sugar as this, demon food, but they eat it very intentionally. And this is why part of the reason I think that we have become so confused with what to eat, because we don't really know what's in our foods, and people have got quite separated and disconnected from ingredients and from cooking. And so if I were to give somebody one piece of advice, it would be to embrace cooking, fall in love with cooking. Just start there. That's it.
Yeah. I mean, you talk about common sense, and the 9 pillars are absolutely about the common sense. And these are the 9 pillars that are the common denominators for all the blue zones. So let's just run through them. Eat mainly plants, as you say. Enjoy wine with friends and family, as I wrote about 30 years ago. Not overeating, eating a little of what you fancy. Interestingly, you say the Okinawans, for example, practicing stopping eating when they're 80% full. Always leave a little on the plate, as my mother would say. I never did. Moving naturally, of course, getting exercise without even trying, walking to a friend's house, walking everywhere, walking up hills like the Sardinians do. Having a sense of purpose, big in Asia. Done quite a lot on the Korean Guide to Happiness, which is very much about the grit and resilience before you get to happiness. But having a sense of purpose is the same sort of thing, the reason for being. Engaging in practices that diffuse stress, such as praying or napping or remembering loved ones, sitting around talking with people. Having a sense of belonging, that's the long tables, the communities. Putting loved ones first, not being a narcissist, not being an ego. Looking after older parents, as we do so many places in the world. And having the right tribe, having a supportive and committed group of friends. Hugely, hugely important, and total common sense. And the disconnect that we have over that is just extraordinary. I mean, it's palpable. We see it all over the place. I mean, what do you think from your research is the reason for the lack of connection? What happened, apart from, leave the food industry out of it, that is clearly the main reason, the selling of a different kind of lifestyle and selling of aspiration as well, that makes you feel very lonely. But what do you think?
It's a very interesting question. I think that we live very fast lives, and just over time, it's led to this kind of erosion of some of the basic things that bring us joy, such as just eating with another person. We've become a bit more isolated and less connected to a community. But I think a way you can achieve that is through cooking. I think food can provide so many things. You know, it's obviously not just about nutrition. It's about connection. It's about community. It's about memory. Like when I think of different dishes, I feel like that's a portal to like my nonna or my granddad. And that's a lovely thing. Even when you read a recipe, that kind of connects you to the person who's written the recipe. And I think that as we've got more disconnected from cooking and it's become less normal, that's been quite fundamental in eroding our sense of community. And that's why I think that that's like the number one thing you can do for your health if you don't do it right now, is to just get into cooking.
Yeah. And, you know, those who don't and who can't for all sorts of reasons, you know, living in food insecurity, not having access to a kitchen, not having access to knives, not being able to cook anything from scratch, not being able to, having to make the decision between eating and heating. You know, I mean, I work for the Food Foundation and I make podcasts for them every week, and we talk about the overfed and undernourished and the fact that children are now up to 7 centimetres smaller than their OECD equivalents. You know, that with our children are shrinking because of the lack of nourishment. It's a shocker. Let's go into some of the blue zones. We've talked about meat. Plant proteins rather than animal proteins is really the rule, isn't it?
Yeah, kind of. But I don't like to pit them against each other in that way. I think people should think about plants as just being this delicious playground of flavour. There's so much going on there. And if you kind of focus your diet on plants, then you can, of course, still enjoy meat, you know, every now and then. But I would focus on a more high quality and less often. But yeah, so eating a diet based on plants, we know is incredibly good for you. And this is always something that I think people find quite surprising, because obviously, plant foods are carbohydrates, and people are so terrified of carbohydrates, but really it's all plant foods. So these places eat high carb diets. People are so shocked by that. And the thing is, carbohydrates encompasses so many foods that it's quite difficult to talk about, because obviously, like, you know, some sweets, they're carbohydrates, but also some lentils are carbohydrates. But if you think more about the quality of what you're eating and the integrity of it, like it has to be real food, then that's a brilliant place to begin.
Yeah. The polyphenols as well, you talk about a lot. I mean, you know, the scientists I've always spoken to have always talked about polyphenols. It's particularly in the olive oil. It's the bit that makes you cough. Then you know you've got something really good. But, you know, the nonnas in Calabria back 30 years ago, they weren't talking about polyphenols.
Yeah, exactly. And this is something that I think about a lot, actually. I think there's a real overcomplication of nutrition. And these people are going on instinct. And that's how my nonna ate. It was an intuitive approach to eating. And I think that that's something that all of us have. We all have instincts for what really nourishes us. But they've kind of got lost because of our strange food environment that we're living in, with all of these non-foods masquerading as food. So it's hard for us to tell, but I think you can get back in touch with those instincts. And if you eat real food, you get a feedback from your body. You don't need to be a scientist. You don't need to be an expert on nutrition. This is something that we can all access and have an innate understanding of. So I think that, you know, maybe sometimes nutrition can be seen as quite elitist. You know, you have to pay for expensive tests, or you have to read these really dense scientific books, and you just don't. You can listen to your body. You can go by kind of ancient wisdom, things we've always understood to be good for us. And I think that you can learn to trust your own instincts again without it being so complicated.
Exactly. And wine is the perfect example of that, isn't it? We've been drinking wine for thousands and thousands of years. And you say that everyone in the blue zones has a little bit of wine with their main meal as a digestive, but also it's the conviviality, isn't it?
Yeah, exactly. It contributes to their well-being. And this goes back to the point about food being more than just nutrition. So they think that the polyphenols, which are this chemical in plants that helps defend the plant in nature, is also helpful for us. So scientists think that maybe the presence of polyphenols in red wine in particular is, feeding our gut microbiome and good for us. But also it could be beneficial because of the fact that people get together, they relax, they talk. I came across this really interesting study when I was doing the book, and it was that people who go to their local pub report being happier than people who don't, and having more friends and being more trusting in people. So when we think about health, I think it's very important not to separate physical and mental health in the way that we do. We're one body, and these things are connected, and your well-being is extremely important. And if you can have these moments of connection and you can build these relationships and you can have this bonding, that is incredibly good for you and for your longevity. We know how important relationships are for healthy longevity. So that aspect of it should be thought about too. And I think people can often be very militant when it comes to diets and wanting to find an enemy all of the time. And that just takes you back to restriction, which I'm completely against. You don't need to have these strict rules to be healthy. You need to love all food, celebrate ingredients, be passionate about it, have a lovely glass of wine with your friends. You don't need to be strict or extreme. And many of these fad diets tell you that you need to live, in the extreme, in the granular. But health comes from your overall diet, not just tiny pinpoint things. It's so much more than that.
Exactly. Your grandmother, your nonna, is a great example to you of the Blue Zone diet, the Mediterranean diet. And she came from southern Italy and she settled in Kent, which is where you tasted her lovely orangey red pasta sauce, which is your first food moment. Tell us about this one.
It just is my most distinct food memory. It's my favourite food in the world. And I think it's an amazing example of like the brilliance of southern Italian cooking, peasant cooking, where they take not much, humble ingredients, and they transform it into something so special, so memorable. And still to this day, it's that kind of food that thrills me the most, the type where it's unassuming and then it's amazing. I'd way rather eat something more simple that has been transformed into something incredible than the fanciest, most luxury ingredients, because it's just more exciting. So it was a simple tomato sauce, but she just had a magic touch. And the thing that I would remember the most is that the colour of your tomato sauce when you're cooking, when you're using tinned tomatoes, has to change from like a very postbox red into a more mellow orangey hue. And she used to stick a bunch of parsley in there, which will kind of act like a tea bag and infuse the sauce with parsley. And now the smell, the only person I know who makes this kind of thing is my mum, but the smell of parsley cooking in a tomato sauce, I just go crazy for. I think this made such an impression on me as well, because it shaped the way that I think about food. She would put this huge bowl of pasta in the middle and a big spoon, and she would spoon it out, and we would have loads of parmesan on the top. We would always have bread with it. You would always eat them at the same time. And that wasn't seen as indulgent. That was just seen as normal. We would have a big salad afterwards, which we would look forward to just as much as the pasta. It wasn't like, oh, we have to eat the salad. It was like, nah, this salad is amazing. Like Nan's dressing on the salad was all so good. So it was, many foods are demonized in our society, but no more than carbohydrates, at least in my lifetime. That's always been, the thing that people are so terrified of. And I think Nonna taught me that that's a very unhelpful way of thinking. It's much better to focus on home cooking, balance, flavour, and not worry so much about these things that they're just not going to affect you. Of course, you can have some bread with your pasta.
Of course. And it's inexpensive, even if you're buying really good ingredients. And your second food moment, the pasta fagioli, is an example of that. And it comes from one of the Blue Zone hotspots, Malocchio in Calabria, where people, many of them, are living well into their 90s, aren't they?
Oh, yeah.
And tell us about this particular recipe and why you chose this one.
So this is common across southern Italy. In fact, they love to combine pasta and legumes. And I think it's also such a winning combination. Pasta and chickpeas is fantastic. Pasta and peas, so underrated, but so good. If ever you want to add something else to your pasta, put some peas in there because it's amazing. But this one I think is the ultimate, and they make it differently depending on where you are in the south of Italy, or like even differently depending on whose house you're in. Like my nonna would have made it differently to my great auntie and etc. But it's brilliant because it's a little bit spicy. You put a little bit of chili in there. It's got this umami, that really lovely savoury flavour. And it's the texture that I love. So it sits at this like glorious midpoint between kind of sticky and creamy. And that's created by the pasta cooking in with the beans and the liquid, and the starch releases, and just makes this most Moorish dish. It's somewhere between a soup and a pasta dish. And what's also so thrilling is that it's so good for you. So legumes, beans, chickpeas, lentils, etc., are eaten in all of the blue zones. It's something that really unites all of them. And they're eaten very often. So in Malocchio, which is a longevity hotspot in Calabria, I interviewed an old lady there, and she said she would eat them every day. She absolutely loved them. They deliver, protein, a lot of fibre, which is also something that we now understand is particularly good for our gut microbiome, and is a great way to get protein without, some of the negative aspects of eating meat, not just for ourselves, but also for the planet. So I absolutely love beans. I cook with them all the time now. And also they can be so fast, convenient, accessible, cheap, easy to store. So I think that's amazing.
Yeah. Total winner. Your slow cooked lamb, leg of lamb with crispy potatoes. Now this comes from your lovely granddad who came from Sardinia, and this Sardinia being a blue zone was the first way it sort of piqued your interest, wasn't it? It was like, oh my God, I know this place. This is extraordinary. Tell us about why Sardinia is a blue zone, and tell us something about that gorgeous leg of lamb.
So I was so happy to find this out because, this is where my granddad is from. And researchers started looking into the area, and they found that there was this huge amount of centenarians who were still, walking around and living like people who were 20 or 30 years younger than them. Really remarkable. And then that's what spurred these researchers to think, okay, there must be other places around the world that are similar to this. So as we were saying before, quite an important factor is that they don't eat much meat. But when they do eat meat, it's special. It's an occasion. It's a kind of a cause for celebration. And it made me think of my granddad's lamb, which he would do maybe once a year, but maybe not even that frequently. And he would take great care when he did it. I think if you're going to eat an animal, you need to treat it with respect. And that's what he did. He would cook it really slowly in the oven. He used to stud it with loads of garlic, like a lot, rosemary. The smell in the house would be phenomenal. And it would cook until it was so tender that you just like nudge it with a fork and it would fall apart. And it was just sensational. And I think that we know that reducing our meat consumption is good for our health. But that doesn't mean that you have to never eat meat. If you want to occasionally do it, then you can, and you should make it amazing. And another thing that they do in the blue zones, and also my nonna used to do, is use a little bit of meat, more like a seasoning. So in my nonna's village, I went recently, and I was speaking to one of my relatives, Camilla, and she was making this tomato sauce. And to flavour the sauce, she puts in kind of like odds and ends of pork, bits of pork, and like bits of tripe. And it would create the most fantastic, deep, rich tomato sauce. And I think that's another good way to do it. Like, meat doesn't have to be the star of the show. It can just be something to add a lot of flavour.
And you know what you're talking about, the way that you're talking about that lamb is a food memory and a ritual, and it has to do with previous generations, and that is where connection happens. The reason that you're still talking about that lamb, you know, decades on from your first experience of it, is because it comes with so much love and so much family and so much wonderful sort of aromas and all the stuff that really set up a food memory. You want to set up new food memories for Britain. You're on a campaign to make aubergine parmigiana, your fourth food moment, into something that's actually going to take the place of lasagna in British hearts. But what you're really saying here is that plants are not seen as a sorry substitute to meat in the blue zones. They are celebrated, and that's really what you want to do, isn't it?
Yeah, I think if you want to reduce your meat consumption, you want to eat things that give you a similar feeling or a similar flavour. And I think with aubergine parmigiana, for anyone who doesn't know, it's like layers of aubergine fried and then layered with tomato sauce and cheese on the top. So it's very reminiscent of a lasagna. And you get these caramelized bits around the edges of the aubergine, which are kind of, they're so satisfying, they're almost meaty. And then you get this sweetness and acidity from the tomato sauce. And then from the mozzarella, you get a richness and a creaminess and a little tang and a milkiness. And it's just like a winning vegetarian dish. And I don't think it's even trying to be vegetarian, which is so common of all of the food in the south of Italy. There's not this distinction. Again, you don't need to pit these things against each other. You just need to enjoy them both for what they are. And again, it's linked to family and memory. I make it, but it's never quite so good when I make it as when my mum makes it. She is just the queen of it. And it will always, you know, even way far into the future, will always remind me of her. And that's something I can pass on to my children in the future. And I think that if you can give your children these kind of food memories, I really think that's a gift for life. The more I think about it, the older I get, I realise that that was a real gift that I got from like my Italian grandparents. But I thought it was completely normal. I thought everyone felt like that about food, and, you know, everybody loved salad and aubergine and olive oil and salt. And then I realised that actually that's not really the case. But I think if you can set those foundations and you can get kids really interested and passionate about ingredients and cooking, they will take that with them for the rest of their lives and pass that on. So I'm really passionate about helping kids get into cooking. I think that would be a fantastic thing for our country, and should really be a focus.
It should. Is your nonna still around?
No, she's not. I miss her a lot, but I'm very connected to her through food, and I think about her all the time. And honestly, I feel like she is my entire career. It was almost a joke at one point, because any piece I would write for any newspaper, I would somehow shoehorn in my nonna. And she's really, like, this book is ostensibly about the blue zones, but it's really like a celebration of the wisdom of grandmothers, like every grandmother, you know, like these nonnas in Italy or, you know, grandmas in India, they have known this kind of wisdom for a long time. And now science, I feel like, is just catching up with it, which is good, because sometimes when you understand the mechanism behind something, it's just a very positive circle after that point. But I love grandmas, and I love, you know, grandmas who cook and these like matriarchal figures. And I think the there's a lot to learn from like looking back and seeing how we used to do things. So yeah, it's about the blue zones, but also it's this celebration of old wisdom.
Thanks for listening. Head over to my Substack for extra bites of Giulia Crouch, and I'll see you next week.